Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
The discovery of new societies confronted Europeans with a dazzling range of beliefs and institutions different from their own. It persuaded some that the world was their oyster, and it led others to begin a revolution in critical thinking. The Renaissance and the New World, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with a confluence of two great movements, the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. And yet we also saw how many of the material things that made exploration possible came out of the Middle Ages, as did many of the motivations of European governments. Primarily the quest for spices and slaves and converts to Christianity. But what about the explorers themselves? Do they reflect a new Renaissance mentality that we define as modern? Or was their vision primarily a medieval one? What kind of men were they? What motivated them? As evidence, we have Richard Chancellor's statement that he was describing his search for a northeast passage in 1553 so that, as he says, he may encourage others to the like travel. Now, this is a very modern kind of self-awareness and an equally modern sense of being part of an evolution, not a one-shot adventure like Marco Polo's trip to China in the 13th century, but an ongoing process. And both are very close to the intellectual temper of the Renaissance. And there is another Renaissance trait which the explorers possessed, and that is their appetite for fame. The passion for glory provides a major theme of Renaissance art, especially with the presentation of distinguished contemporaries as memorable characters from antiquity. This is Gianfrancesco Gonza, an Italian captain general depicted as Mars, the god of war, while his wife Isabella is Venus. Some explorers like Columbus were also fired by missionary zeal. But fame, the desire to be known for having accomplished great deeds, this was a strong component in the explorers' motivation. And that became especially true as more and more travel writing came on the market, as printing spread and began to compete with romances of chivalry. So here you have the search for fame, the search for fortune, but within a context of exactness and full proof, and in a world where it seemed that very few things were still left undone, and if they were undone, that was a good reason for getting them done. And this is very much a Renaissance attitude. But we're on even firmer ground when we turn, oddly enough, to theory. Theory was the fuel of action in the Renaissance, as it had not been in the Middle Ages. The revival of antiquity, the rediscovery of theories which appeared to have influenced action in the past, produced new concepts and models for action that would change the world. The humanists, or at least their pupils, really did try to be the all-round men that Cicero praised. The architects and artists were actually affected by theoretical treatises based on assumptions about what had produced great art in ancient times. And the soldiers, who now had longer pauses between crises, adopted all sorts of military ideas from the ancients about how to organize their troops, or fortify, or besiege a city. And it might have had the same effect on geography if it hadn't been for the actual voyages which forced Renaissance scholars to reconsider their theories about the size and shape of the world in the light of actual experience. Not all of the classical theories agreed either. Ptolemy, a 2nd century Greek, was one established authority who believed that you couldn't sail around the world because Africa merged with a large continent that filled the southern hemisphere and joined Africa to India. On the other hand, there was the geographer Strabo, a contemporary of Augustus, who thought that the ocean sea to the west washed the southern shores of Asia. You had to be careful when you sailed the ocean because you might fall over the edge. Still, Strabo believed, to quote him, that the uninhabited world forms a complete circle, itself meeting itself, so that if the immensity of the Atlantic did not prevent it, we could sail from Iberia to India along one and the same parallel. By the early 1400s, Strabo's theories were gaining ground as sea charts and ship logs got better. There was also constant contact between the sailors, the theorists, and the map makers. The best example of this could be found at Sagres, at the southwest tip of Portugal, where in the middle 1430s the Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator, a remarkable figure, founded a small court to which he attracted seamen, cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and instrument makers, and from which, with improved ships and maps and instruments, he sent out expeditions that went further and further down the African coast, practically to the Ivory Coast. Henry's ultimate purpose, and he wasn't alone in this, was to outflank the power of Islam and to establish direct commercial contact with the source of gold and slaves, ivory and spices in Africa and in Asia. So Henry's brother went to Florence to buy maps, and Columbus elicited an important letter from another Florentine geographer, Toscanelli, that assured him that he could get to China by sailing west. And when the sailors made their discoveries, they were quickly recorded in the maps the cartographers drew up and revised for other sailors to use. This map belonged to Columbus. In essence, this process of exploration was the first demonstration of the scientific method, proceeding from hypothesis to experiment and then on to a new hypothesis. And it was demonstrated for all interested men to see in the largest and the most dramatic way. The hypothesis that there was open water between Europe and Asia to the west, as Columbus first believed, was disproved not by abstract calculation, but concretely by revealing an enormous new territory full of exotic peoples and providing a new way of life for thousands of soldiers and settlers. And it was a continuous process with the findings and ideas of one man entered on maps until further experimental voyages disproved them or revised them. What you have to remember is that the scientific method which we take as the hallmark of modern thinking could not be applied rigorously in a pure scientific field, in astronomy, or physics or chemistry, until the 17th century, when the pendulum clock and the telescope and the microscope were developed. Before that, however hard the would-be scientist thought, it was difficult to verify his ideas because the means for scientific proof were rudimentary. One field where you could actually verify theory was the field of discovery through the cooperation between the theorizers at home and the observers in their ships. You might even say that the first scientific laboratory was the world itself. So the age of discovery and the Renaissance were in partnership. But it was a fumbling and confused relationship because the first explorers carried with them a mass of medieval presuppositions which prevented them from making a properly objective report on what they saw. What the public wanted and got a lot of were monsters and marvels, and giants and dwarfs and headless men with faces in their chests, and dog-headed men, and men with one huge foot which they could use as a sunshade, and all kinds of other grotesques. Another feature in the new lands that people wanted to find or to hear about was the existence of an earthly paradise. Some golden age existence where men could be found happy, naked, free, without government or property, without disease or melancholy. One major reason why Europeans wanted to believe in the existence of paradise was that they fared so badly at home, where they were torn by war, eaten by plague, brutalized by poverty and famine and all kinds of other troubles. So explorers were tempted to color their facts to fit their hopes, and publicists popularized and vulgarized their reports to turn the Indian into a noble savage and life in the New World into a kind of moral symbol of the Golden Age. But these fantasies were going to collide with something else, something very urgent and very concrete, which was the religious issue. Significantly, the first question European intellectuals asked about the natives of the New World was not what are they like, but can they be saved? And that was because the societies being discovered in the New World did not fit into the framework of the book of Genesis. So it wasn't clear whether Jesus died for these creatures and whether they were really human at all. The question was important because the sort of treatment the Indian might expect depended on the answer. The view that the Indian was an animal, hence a natural slave, this view was pressed with some force. 16th century Englishmen, for instance, assumed that the Indians were on the whole wild, ignorant, and animal-like. For their part, the Indians quite sensibly refuse to work the hours, wear the clothes, follow the diet of Europeans. So the way was open for the pessimists to point out that Indians were incapable of living virtuously and freely, and that they must therefore be by nature slaves. This notion fitted very well with the growing clamor for cheap labor to work in silver mines like this one in Peru, or on sugar estates in a climate which sapped the energy of white men and which would soon take the lives of the natives. Even worse would be the devastating European diseases for which Indians had no immunities. With European brutality confirmed by economic need, with forcible conversion to Christianity accepted as common necessity, the slave trade took on a new and long-enduring lease of life, or rather death. While in this painting, a European artist depicts Indians worshipping a column erected by the French explorer Laudonnière. So here we find several further ingredients of the modern world. A new treasury of myth and of incentives on one hand, and on the other, the role of the European as exploiter and colonist, rationalizing his activities by drawing on those very myths to justify his doings. And yet the counter-agents were at work within the experience itself. Above all, the novel tendency to compare and contrast, which arose out of the variety of new information and experience pouring in on Europeans during the Renaissance. Where medieval people reasoned by association, learning about one thing by connecting it with something similar, modern reasoning involves contrast as well as association. This is different from that. What do I learn from the comparison? And this kind of thinking entered our intellectual habits, not only when the humanists of the Renaissance revived the civilization of pre-Christian antiquity and compared it with their own, but also when newly discovered societies all over the world confronted Europeans with a wide range of governments and religions and social habits that were different from their own. But before the sophisticated races of the East or the more primitive races of the West could present thought-provoking contrasts, they had to be seen not merely as picturesque, but as the product of a specific environment. You had to go beyond the striking detail, the nakedness, the war paint. You had to go on to a more anthropological approach. And you begin to find this when one of Vasco da Gama's officers spends the night with the natives of the Cape of Good Hope to see how they live and what they eat. Or when missionaries begin to learn the languages and the religious beliefs of the peoples they were trying to convert, because they could only hope to convince the natives when they had entered into their world and values. And by the 16th century, the greatest mind of the 16th century, I mean Michel de Montaigne, is fascinated by cannibals, by so-called savages who seem far less savage and far closer to happiness and virtue than his own fellow citizens. Not just far less savage, more sensible too. Cannibals kill, but they kill for a purpose. They want to eat. We, says Montaigne, we kill to no good purpose. And so here, 400 years ago, we can hear the forest murmurs of relativism. But it was very far away, and it was going to be a very slow process that culminated in the 18th century, when the comparative study of strange societies and religions and brave new worlds would lead to a critical re-evaluation of European religion, philosophy, and political structures. But that had its roots, I think, in the Renaissance, in the growing willingness based on a growing necessity to see, estimate, evaluate, test, to learn more and actually use it. Invest it, so to speak, in order to learn more still, to seek not only knowledge, but precise knowledge, to examine not only the self subjectively, which was one of the great joys of Renaissance humanists, but the world objectively, because objectivity was the great liberator, the widener of mental horizons, the progenitor of modern science. It was fed by forcing the imagination not inward, but outward, exposing it to challenging information about different ways of life. It was the humanists like Erasmus who laid the ground for this critical and comparative approach to information and experience. And when Erasmus and the other humanists said that one authority was superior to another, that a Roman author was a better source of wisdom than a doctor of the medieval church, they implied the right to decide between different authorities, and therefore the possibility to judge for yourself. And the best of them, like Leonardo da Vinci, decided to place experience and experiment above any book, above any second-hand authority, and this was something new. Leonardo was not only a great painter of subtlety and understated harmony, he was also a great architect and engineer. His great love was scientific observation, especially anatomy. He was fascinated by the forces that move nature. This sketch is from his study of hydrology, the properties of water. And he approached these forces in a thoroughly empirical way. When he works out his geological theories, he doesn't look for a text in Aristotle, he looks around him. He notes that things that are born in salt water are found on high mountains far from present seas. And he concludes, the phenomena we witness explain the past. He dissects bodies, he suggests the possibilities of comparative anatomy, he predicts the helicopter, and when he dies in France in 1519, his title is first painter, architect, and mechanic of the king. Soon after Leonardo's death, a French physician, Ambroise Paré, provided the formula of the new scientific approach when he wrote that we have to use the ancients as stilts or towers from which we can see further than they did. But, said Paré, whenever experiment contradicted the ancients, we must follow what we see. Tradition is no use if it just encourages you to go on making other people's mistakes because you're too lazy or too timid to strike out for yourself. I would prefer to do everything by myself than to fall into error with the sages and even with all mankind. Knowledge, says Paré, is a great thing, but only if it is based on experience. This new attitude was going to lead men to examine things for themselves: natural phenomena, political institutions, even the Bible. Until the Renaissance, all these had been accepted simply because they were there. Now they could be considered in terms of appropriateness, effectiveness, and opportunity. Obviously, this didn't all happen at once. Most people conformed as they had always done without much question. But the fact remains that by the 1600s, knowledge and science had ceased to rest on an inert tradition transmitted from the past. They became the knowledge, science, investigation of what is, which you acquire by searching and looking and drawing conclusions from what you see. And this is a revolution, or at least it's the beginning of a revolution, as we shall see in the programs ahead.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.